Chapter 10. Getting ready for dinner ranked among the worst experiences of Allie's life. After her father had swept out of the house like an iceberg, she'd stayed coiled on the couch like a spring, just working through the tight ball of anger that was burning a hole through her chest. She knew from experience that this kind of anger, real anger, not the temporary irritation of someone cutting in line or an inconvenient phone call, had to be handled carefully. Unlike for humans, there could be some dire physiological consequences for allowing this kind of temper to go unchecked. Thankfully, she'd been dealing with her temper for most of her life, and at this stage she'd learned a few tricks for keeping it in check. Breathing exercises were the simplest and most reliable. She pressed her back against the soft couch and focused on the way it felt to inhale, the effects of each breath on her individual ribs, the way her whole body seemed to expand with a breath, then contract with its expulsion. This is all you have to do, right? Now, Allie, she told herself over and over again. Just breathe in, breathe out. This is all that exists. Nothing outside of this couch is real. Not the alpha, not your father, not the pack, not the village. Not Darius. Her pulse spiked, and she felt another stab of pain in her eyes as they threatened to shift color. All right. No thinking about Darius until she had herself under control. She wished irrationally that Ben was here. He'd know how to calm her down. He always had. He never tried to criticize her for being angry or to rationalize her feelings away. He honored her feelings and helped her digest and work through them. She knew he'd be just as angry as she was if he'd witnessed the conversation she'd just had with her father, too. She visualized his face, his hands, the warm comfort of his presence. She shut her eyes and imagined that instead of being curled up on the couch, she was curled up in his arms. It was childish, and she couldn't help but think that she was being ridiculous, but it just helped so much. Within 10 minutes, in combination with her breathing exercises, she felt the tight ball of anger in her chest finally dissolve away completely. She grabbed her phone from her pocket and called him. She was mostly under control now, not in any danger of flipping to wolf form and murdering a bunch of civilians at least. But still she wanted to hear his voice. And sure enough, a quick conversation with him had her feeling better again. Almost good enough to face the prospect of another dinner with her parents, the Alpha and the Frog Boy. When they hung up, she smiled down at the phone for a moment, then jumped when she realized what time it was. Crap, she swore to her empty house. No time to keep wallowing in her own self-righteousness. If she didn't start getting ready now, she'd be late for dinner. Yet more ammo for her father to throw at her. You can do this, Allie, she told herself over and over in the shower as she washed the hairspray out of her hair and the remnants of the makeup from her face. Just turn up, be professional, then go home. It's only a few hours. Unfortunately, a few hours with the frog guy felt like a few centuries in subjective time, and her father had made it quite clear that she was expected not only to maintain cordial, professional relations with the guy. She was meant to go further than that, to be actively nice to him, to be friendly. The nausea that rose up in her chest at that thought had nothing to do with her lingering hangover either. The shower made her feel a bit better, but choosing a dress for the night was agonizing. She was annoyed at what her father had said about the dress she'd worn the night before. Did he really expect her to wear knee-length church wear to a Manhattan nightclub? And was half tempted to wear the same dress to dinner. But being spiteful wasn't professional. Besides, she hated the idea of Darius's froggy little eyes lingering on the dress's low neckline. Finally, she settled for a high-necked gray gown her mother had bought for her, with a hem that fell to her ankles, just a shade too formal for the event, and the shape of it left no room for ogling or staring. Perfect. But by the time she was halfway through putting her makeup on, the anger was back. It was as though the closer the clock got to dinner time, the more her resentment built. Wasn't a father supposed to love and protect his daughter? Wasn't Darius the kind of man Andre should be chasing off with a shotgun, not inviting over to family dinner? It was humiliating to feel so vulnerable and helpless in her own family home. And surely any alpha worth his salt would see what was going on and stand up for his pack member, for that matter. She caught her breath a little at such a blatantly disrespectful thought about the alpha. This guy had really gotten under her skin. Allie all but forced herself out of the house and into her car when the time came to leave. For once in her life, she spent the whole trip praying for red Lights. Every minute spent in traffic was a minute she didn't have to spend. With Darius staring at her, touching her without her consent, smiling that hideous smug smile at her stone-faced father, manipulating her family against her. It was all too short a trip before she was pulling up outside her family home again. Sure enough, there were the now familiar cars that indicated that Nicholas and the hated Darius were already here. She couldn't catch any kind of break, could she? Not that being alone with her father would be much better at the moment. She couldn't shake the memory of his cold eyes, staring down at her, full of rage at his willful daughter. Just a few hours, Allie, she chanted to herself. Her phone buzzed with a supportive text from Ben, and that gave her just enough strength to propel herself over the threshold and into the house. Alexandra, came her mother's voice, bright and sing-song from the upper landing. Olga looked resplendent as always, wearing a baby pink gown that Allie hadn't seen her in before. Had she been shopping? Or just saving this one for a special occasion? The expression on her face was a familiar one, her polite party smile, the one that said everything was wonderful and that nothing had ever gone wrong. Her perfect little family smile. But Allie could see through the facade to the knowing, watchful gleam underneath it. Olga knew exactly what Allie had discussed with her father earlier that day, and she was keeping a sharp eye on her daughter. There went any hope of maternal support. Allie thought miserably. Mother, she said listlessly, plastering her own attempt at a perfect party smile onto her unwilling face. It felt like her cheeks were actually creaking with the effort, like rusted hinges. She had to summon an image of Ben from the night before to bring some life to the smile. Look, I'm wearing the dress you bought me. Olga's false smile widened. I noticed how lovely it still looks on you, even with the extra. Well, never mind. Allie gritted her teeth. She'd made the mistake of mentioning to her mother once that she'd gained 10 pounds since her 25th birthday. The weight had since come off, not that Allie had any concerns at all about what her body looked like, but Olga didn't seem to feel the same way. Allie could feel her mother's eyes roving speculatively across her body. It was almost as uncomfortable as being scrutinized by Darius. Speak of the frog-faced devil, Allie, came that repulsive voice as Olga descended the stairs. There he was, nauseating as always, and Allie couldn't help but frown as she looked at him. Was he seriously wearing a tuxedo? What on earth for? So wonderful to see you. Good evening, Darius, she said, trying to put a bit of life into her voice, mindful of her mother's watchful eye. Her father wasn't here to judge her conduct yet, but she knew for a fact that Olga would report back every little detail. What's the occasion? Why, seeing you, of course, he said, and she suppressed the urge to shudder. There was a knowing gleam in his eye that hadn't been there last week, and it seemed to match the look in her mother's eyes as the woman took her gently but firmly by the arm and lead her through to the dining room. There they were. Her father, deep in conversation with Nicholas. They both looked up at her with identical calculating looks, and she could tell by the way their conversation stopped on her entry that they had been talking about her. Great. The tale of the disobedient daughter was being told to the alpha of the pack. She could only hope that her father would have kept the details of her defiance to himself to save face. Nicholas didn't seem disappointed in her at least, but there was a watchful cast to his expression that she hated. It felt like everyone was in on some secret that she wasn't privy to. But she could hardly just demand to know what was going on, could she? That wouldn't be very high society wolf of her. So she plastered on a fake smile, just like her mother's, and joined everyone at the table. Unfortunately, she wasn't lucky enough to have escaped sitting next to Darius. This time, she sat opposite Andre, who stared right through her with his cold eyes, and Darius smugly took the seat opposite the alpha, moving his chair far closer to hers than she would have liked. If it were up to her, he'd be on the other side of the country, or further if possible. Discreetly she crossed her legs in such a way that her body was angled away from his. It was a small gesture, but it made her feel better. Olga sat at the head of the table, constantly up and down to fetch people drinks. She was in fine form, chattering wildly away about the intricacies of event planning. But Allie couldn't shake the feeling that something was up. Olga never talked this much unless she was under instruction. Something was happening. She could feel it in the way Andre, Nicholas, and Darius kept glancing at each other, in the way that they kept avoiding her gaze. Tension in her body got worse and worse. She could feel a headache starting in the back of her head from the clenching in the muscles of her neck. What were they up to? Did it have to do with her work? Was she going to be asked to spend even more time with Darius? She wasn't sure she could handle it. I think it's about time we shared the good news, don't you? Darius said. Eventually, sometime in the middle of the main course, Allie had been picking at her food, feeling too trapped and miserable to eat with any enthusiasm, and she looked up sharply at the smug tone in his voice. I think so, Nicholas agreed, a smile breaking out across the alpha's face. I think poor Allie's had enough of the suspense, don't you? Her father looked at her pointedly, and she cleared her throat, trying to channel her mother's sunny disposition. I have noticed you all looking at each other quite a bit since I got here. What's the conspiracy? It's about the hotel, Darius said, glancing at her sideways and then at Andre, who smiled coolly back at him. Allie clenched her jaw behind her. Smile. More changes? I don't have any of the documents with me, unfortunately, so... Oh, Allie, you're always such a diligent worker, Olga trilled unexpectedly. She usually backed off when the men started talking about business, but this time she was actively engaging in the conversation. What was going on? Such a strong, driven young woman. We're so proud of you, darling. You ought to hear how I carry on to my friends about my hardworking career girl. They're quite sick of my bragging. Allie's smile grew even more forced as her worry grew. What on earth was her mother talking about? You work so hard, darling. So hard. For the family, for the company, for the pack. And it's about time you were rewarded for all that work. Absolutely, Nicholas agreed, his voice cutting sleekly across Olga's. You've proved yourself to the pack, Alexandra. You're an incredibly important and valuable member of our society. You've worked so hard on Darius's project. You've shown him what an asset you are, and you've reflected well on the pack. And that's why. Oh, let me tell her, Darius gushed suddenly, spinning in his seat to face her. I want to see her face when she realizes. When I realize what? What's going on? Allie's smile felt like thin plastic. Sheeting stretched across her face. Didn't you wonder why I wanted to install a bridal suite in the hotel? Darius purred, leaning forward to take her unwilling hand in his clammy grasp. Didn't you wonder why I was so set on the hotel being a wedding venue? Ever since I met you, Allie dearest, I knew we were meant to be together. You're perfect for me. Beautiful, intelligent, strong. And by forging an alliance between our packs, our children will be heirs to the strongest wolf pack on the East Coast. Maybe someday the world. Allie felt a ringing in her ears. Surely she was hallucinating. Surely this man had not just asked her to marry him or even told her she was going to be marrying him. She looked up at the other people around the table and saw happy, expectant faces. Her mother was almost vibrating with excitement. Look at her. She can hardly believe it. Olga trilled, and there was a warning in her eyes that only Allie would have picked up on. Don't worry, Allie, I'm a traditionalist. I've already got your father's blessing for our marriage, Darius said smugly, and Alpha Nicholas is in full favor as well. Indeed, Nicholas said. This is an excellent match for you and for the pack. With our forces combined, we'll be able to start taking down weaker packs and growing our strength. And your family company stands to receive a lot of extra business, he added with a wink to Andre. Don't worry, my darling, I'll help you plan everything, Olga said, beaming. You're going to be such an exquisite bride. This is going to be the social event of the season. There was a dull roaring sound in Allie's ears. She plastered a plastic smile to her face and retreated into the privacy of her own head for the rest of dinner. She must have managed enough smiles and nods to please her father. He gave her a brisk nod of approval as the meal wound down. Somehow she managed to stammer through some excuses. Early night, much to do in the morning, thanks for a lovely evening, and all but staggered out of the house. She emerged in the cool evening air, where she took great gasping breaths as though she hadn't inhaled since she'd entered the house. Marry Darius. Her parents, her alpha, they not only wanted her to be in the presence of that slimeball but to marry him, to have children with him, to lead their pack to some kind of warlike glory by his side. Her vision started to blur. It was unthinkable. Absolutely unthinkable. She hurled herself into her car and floored the accelerator, moving away from her family home as fast as her engine would take her. heedless of the danger. She had to get away. Had to think. Had to come up with some kind of way out of this. Halfway home, she pulled over and yanked her phone out of her bag. She had to talk. Chapter 11. For once in his life, Ben was feeling cautiously positive about the future. He spent the afternoon with the Alpha and Alan. Once business talk was over, they just chatted like friends, over a few more drinks while they waited for the elders to arrive. It was funny he'd spent so long as a lone wolf in town that he'd forgotten the absolute joy of relaxing around people. Not just people, packmates. Wolves just weren't wired to be alone. He wondered to himself how many of his bad habits, whether it was drinking, going out late, sleeping with near strangers, or his insomnia, had to do with a simple lack of social connection. After all, the last few weeks he'd been sleeping better than he ever had, even with the usual stresses of his life. A lot of it had to do with Allie, of course. He hoped something was happening there. It was hopelessly complicated, of course, and he knew it was naive of him to just hope it would all turn out through the sheer force of their love for one another. But surely there was a reason that love finds a way was such a cliché, right? Things didn't become clichés unless they were at least a little bit true. And though his world was getting big and complicated, especially with this new development, the assistance he was being asked to offer to his pack, he knew deep in his gut that his love for Allie was at the core of his being. The strength of that love had staggered him. He tried to hide it and drown it and forget about it, but even 10 solid years of drinking and partying and trying to drown out the memory of her touch had been powerless in the face of her. What other woman could reduce him to a teenager with a single line of text? And sure, everyone had told him it was just hormones, just lust, just infatuation. He'd even believed them for a little while. But lust, hormones, infatuation, those things would have gone away in time. If it had been just a high school romance, he wouldn't have felt what he'd felt when she had turned around in that club, and he'd seen her face for the first time in years. Waking up with her in his arms wouldn't have felt like coming home, like having a missing limb restored, like waking up for the first time to realize that the world was a pretty good place after all. Penny for your thoughts, Ben? The Alpha's amused voice interrupted his thoughts, and he jumped, knowing he'd been staring into the bottom of a half-finished glass of scotch for longer than he'd realized. And he'd been thinking about Allie. God knew what kind of silly expressions had crossed his face. Rex grinned at him, a knowing look in the Alpha's eyes. He didn't miss much, that guy. Oh, Ben stammered, not sure what to say. I've seen that look in a few young men's eyes before, Alan interjected, similarly knowing grin on his face. Is she a local? Mercifully, the ringing of the doorbell interrupted that particular line of inquiry, and Rex and Alan rose to their feet, all business as the first of the elders arrived. Ben followed them, feeling a little awkward. He knew that a lot of people hadn't forgiven him for briefly abandoning the pack all those years ago, and he was apprehensive too about them finding out that he was helping the pack in this semi-official capacity now. But hadn't he paid his dues? 10 years he'd worked to be a valuable member of FEL, long hours at the grocery store, nothing but polite and friendly to even the most hostile and suspicious of locals. And besides, whatever the elders might think, the pack needed him. Who else had such a keen insight into what was going on with Sanguine? He'd just have to keep his wits about him and make sure that any information he gave them couldn't lead back to Allie, or harm her in any way. That was the most important thing, he realized, a little dizzy with that revelation. He'd see his pack destroyed before he saw her harmed. Surely not, he thought, blankly, trying to examine that feeling more closely. He was a wolf. He was hardwired to protect his pack above all else, wasn't he? And Allie wasn't even a pack member. If anything, she was a rival. So why did he feel closer to her than to anyone in FEL? He was pulled from these reflections as more elders arrived, each one carrying a plate or a pot. Tradition dictated that these events were potlucks, he supposed. There was something quaint and charming about that. Ben made his polite greetings to each guest, surprised to find that they met him courteously. Perhaps Rex had made it known that he'd decided to invite the most controversial young wolf in the village along to this meeting, Ben thought with amusement. Certainly, nobody seemed surprised to see him, and when the meeting began properly, he was gratified to find that they were all interested in what he had to say, grateful for his contributions and seemingly more than willing to accept his help. They must be more scared of Sanguine than I thought, he reflected wryly. But was that it? Or was he actually finally receiving the acceptance that he'd craved for so long? When the meeting came to a close, the elders showed no sign of leaving. In fact, they all made their way over to the table where the food had been put, and set about serving themselves a potluck dinner, chatting happily between them about the week's events. Ben was beginning to realize that these get-together served a dual function of business and socializing, and he was surprised to find that he was having a nice time. He didn't feel any need to get blackout drunk, as he often did when he was stressed. He'd swapped from scotch to soda before the meeting, and felt no inclination to swap back, even when Rex offered. He caught an approving glance from Alan when he declined the bottle and felt a curious combination of shame and pride. Maybe his drinking habits weren't as private as he thought they were. Why were wolves so good at keeping across gossip? This was why, he supposed, glancing around at the buzzing crowd of Fell's most influential residents. A few dozen people catching up in this focused way every week. This was the kind of thing that kept packs together. Communication. Simply spending time together over a communal meal. Not quite the same as the olden days, which would have involved a hunt first, but still, there was something very primally satisfying about the ritual of it. Oh, Ben found himself hoping he'd be invited to more of these meetings in the future. It was surprising how much he was enjoying catching up with everyone. Working at the grocery store meant he wasn't exactly a social pariah, but the more conversations he got into, the more he began to realize how short the little chats he had with people doing their shopping really were. It was no way to stay connected. Night had well and truly fallen when he felt his phone buzz in his pocket. He was mid-conversation with the Sanderson twins, who were bickering furiously about which NHL team was going to take the Stanley Cup that year. Ben didn't know much about hockey, but he knew better than to side with either woman, not when they were glaring at each other like that. He excused himself, ducking into a side room and pulling his phone out of his pocket, delighted to see Allie's name on the screen. "Hey," he said warmly into the handset, but the grin that had spread across his face faded when he heard the tone in her voice. "What's wrong, love?" He could hear the distant roar of traffic in the background and gathered that she was in the car. She'd had her family dinner scheduled that night. She'd been complaining about it earlier. What could have happened that would have made her pull her car over halfway home just to call him? Her father was insufferable, and this Darius guy sounded like a real piece of work, true, but she was tough and used to poor treatment besides. Something must have really rattled her to have shaken her up badly enough to call him. "Ben, they want me to marry him." Her voice came across the phone and she sounded as sick as he felt at that idea. "Darius, they want me to marry Darius. He proposed at dinner." "Well, he didn't even propose, actually, he just told me we were getting married and just expected me to fall in line." "What did you say?" Ben asked, his heart thudding sickly in his chest. "I couldn't say anything. My mother cut in about how excited she was to plan the wedding and what a beautiful bride I was going to be and all that crap. And my dad had already basically threatened to rip my throat out if I was on anything less than my best behavior. And the alpha was there. You know what that's like." Ben bit his lip. He knew all too well how powerful an influence the alpha of a pack could have. There was such a strong inclination to do what they wanted, to make them happy, to be a good wolf and do what the pack needed you to do. He'd been feeling it himself all night. From what he understood, it wasn't a conscious exertion of force on the part of the alpha, but it was nevertheless a powerful tool, and deadly in the hands of the wrong wolf. A shudder ran down his spine at the memory of trying to please the psychopath who used to run the Sanguine pack. But there was no time for that now. Not when Allie was in such a bind. "You did the right thing, love," he said now, speaking rapidly and with as much love as he could put into his voice. Allie needed him. He needed to make her feel better, give her the support she needed to deal with this horrific situation. Causing a scene wouldn't have done anything but make them angry. "We'll find a way to get you out of it." "I'm not marrying him, Ben," she said, her voice low and deadly. "If they try to make me, I don't know what'll happen." A bark of hostile laughter. "They'd better put plenty of elastic in my dress, that's for sure." Ben chuckled, trying to ignore the sick feeling in his stomach. A mid-ceremony shift. How romantic. What a beautiful bride, Allie caroled in a fairly accurate impersonation of her mother, from what Ben could remember of the severe older woman. Look how her pelt and claws match her earrings. He laughed. It was a good sign that she was still able to joke about the situation. It meant she was in control. You'll start a trend, babe. Ben, it's bad. That heaviness was back in her voice. The reason for this marriage crap. It looks like Nicholas is on the warpath. Darius is from a powerful pack. They're using me as a bargaining chip. Basically, if he gets me, he'll help Nicholas take over all the local packs, and who knows what he'll do after that? You know how ambitious he is. Ben, they said Fell would be their first target. Ben swore softly. You're sure? Yeah. They figure if they can take Rex down, they'll take his territory and his people and then turn their focus to the next nearest pack. I don't know if there's anything you can do, but I'm at Rex's right now, he said. Can I warn him? I won't say it was you who told me, but if I can get him some advance warning. Of course you can. He'd never heard her voice sound so hollow and brittle. I've been so loyal to this pack my whole life, and this is all I am to them. In the end, a bargaining chip to be traded off to some rich asshole? I'm so smart, she growled, and Ben almost laughed. I'm so smart and talented and good at my job, Ben. Why didn't they just send me to finishing school and teach me to play bridge if they were going to sell me off as a trophy wife? You're not going to be anyone's trophy, Ben told her as firmly as he could. No way. He heard her take a deep breath. It sounded like the exercises she used to do to get on top of her temper. He'd seen that rage of hers in action once or twice, and he didn't envy anyone from Sanguine if they got on the wrong side of it. Thanks for talking me down, Ben. I better get home and start figuring out what I'm going to do. Go warn Rex. Maybe we can avoid too much bloodshed. Stay in touch, he said gently. You're not alone in this, I promise. I'll get you out of there if it's the last thing I do. Love you, she murmured. Love you too. More than anything. He stood for a moment in the empty study when they'd hung up, staring through the window into the dark yard beyond. This was worse than he could have imagined. He had to get her out of there. Plans raced through his head. He wanted nothing more than to drop everything, jump in his car, drive over there at 100 miles an hour, bundle her into the back seat, point the car at the horizon and floor it till they ran out of gas. But he couldn't do that. Not now. If he and Allie just disappeared, there'd be blood. Who knew what this Darius guy would do if his intended bride was snatched away from him? He'd already made it clear he didn't care what she wanted. It wouldn't be hard to figure out who was responsible for her abduction, and the violence would fall on Rex and on the entire community of Fell. He couldn't do that. He couldn't abandon them. Not again. Rex, I need to talk to you, he said in a low voice, having found the alpha amidst a gaggle of elders who gave him curious looks but allowed him to take the man away from them. Rex gestured for Alan to join them too, and they stepped into the little study he'd taken his phone call in. He filled them in as quickly as he could, omitting the detail of it being Allie who had told him what was happening. Rex frowned. Thank you for telling me this, Ben. We've been worried about the Sanguine Pack mobilizing against us for some time. This is just confirmation that we need to escalate preparations. In the meantime, you better make sure your source is safe, Alan added. If they realize we're ready for them, they might start looking for possible leaks. Ben nodded, full of dread. If they found out Allie had given him the information she had, even being the daughter of an influential member of their pack was unlikely to keep her safe. You're more than welcome to keep your source here, Rex said. There's plenty of space, and it's probably the last place Sanguine would reach in the event of an attack. Ben nodded, grateful to the Alpha for the idea. The idea of Allie being tucked up safely in Rex's house was much more appealing than knowing she was alone in her home, where the entirety of Sanguine knew where to find her. Whether or not she'd be willing to just stay inside while a war raged was another question entirely, of course, but they'd cross that bridge when they came to. Go now, Rex said. Make the calls you need to make. Ben nodded. He made some brief goodbyes on his way through the crowded meeting, but his phone was in his hand, and he was itching to call Allie. He'd already spent too much time making plans. It was time for action. He just hoped she'd be willing to stay at Rex's place until they could sort all of this out. But when his fifth call went to voicemail, Ben felt real panic gripping his heart for the first time. Allie would never let calls ring out like that. Now, Chapter 12. How she didn't crash her car on the way home was anyone's guess. Allie had never driven so recklessly in her life. Thankfully, Sunday evening wasn't a very busy time, not in her little hometown anyway, and her lack of focus didn't prove fatal. Still, she almost knocked over the letterbox pulling into her driveway, and she was in a foul mood indeed as she unlocked the front door. To think that when she'd left a few hours ago, she'd thought that this would be the best part of the night, the part where she finally got home and away from those men. Admittedly, it was good to be in her own space again, but the sheer weight of what she'd learned was making the relief she'd anticipated hard to feel. How could her father do this to her? She felt tears sting the back of her eyes. Even thinking of the way he'd sat there, cold and quiet as an iceberg as her world fell down around her ears. It was a positively medieval situation. Sure, she knew that a lot of old traditional families tended to meddle in the romantic life of their children. It was a big part of why she hadn't dated very much. That and Ben, she thought to herself with a little smile. But even the thought of her lover couldn't do much to improve the mood she was in. She'd never believed her father would take it this far, that he would instruct her to marry someone and give her no choice. He'd all but told her that she'd be disowned from the family if she didn't do what she was told. At the time, she thought he was talking about being polite to Darius and working with him cordially despite his creepiness, not marrying the guy. Well, marrying him wasn't going to happen, that was for sure. She knew for a grim certainty that she'd rather bite her own throat out than spend more than a minute around that man. The fact that he'd raised the idea of children made her skin crawl. The idea of touching him made her want to throw up, let alone the various physical interactions that would be necessary if they were to make children together. Nausea roiled in her stomach. She felt a giddy half-mad little laugh escape her. What would her parents say if she insisted on IVF to conceive? No, it wasn't an option. No part of it was an option. She'd rather die than marry this man. It was Ben she loved, if she was going to marry anyone. But that was a thought that belonged to a different time and place. She couldn't think of someone as wonderful as him in the same breath as Darius. Thankfully he'd picked up the phone, she thought, smiling. Having him to settle her nerves was the only thing that had gotten her home in the first place. But now she was here and she needed to make a plan. She needed to think. She settled on her couch and forced herself to do a few of her breathing exercises. Not that anger was her principal emotion at the moment, but she knew it would well up sooner or later the more she thought about what her family and her alpha had tried to do to her. Her alpha didn't pack. Leaders have a responsibility to protect their pack members. Could she have made it any clearer that Darius made her feel like clawing her own skin off? Was he really so self-interested and obsessed with his dreams of conquest that he'd force a young woman to marry a slimeball just to get the power and influence he wanted? Well, it was becoming clear that there was no home for her in Sanguine any more. She'd been willing to sacrifice her youth to work hard and do well at her company. That was all well and good. But she wasn't going to sacrifice her happiness like this. Some things were just too much to bear. Ben had told her that 10 years ago when he'd finally snapped under the psychotic treatment of the old alpha and fled back to Fel. Some things were too much to bear. Among them being abused and mistreated by your alpha, by your family, by everything that was meant to support you and be on your side. Allie could feel the anger burning now as she strode into her room, dug out the suitcase she took on work trips and started packing some clothes into it. No, her family had let her down for the last time, betrayed her honestly for the last time. She wasn't some pawn that could be swapped and traded. She was a queen, and if they didn't see that, then she'd go somewhere where she could live her own life. The resolution to leave once made was oddly freeing. She found herself smiling as she worked, picking through her clothes, choosing the ones she wore the most. It wasn't likely that she'd be able to come back here once she'd left town. She was counting on her family's belief in her as a good and obedient little daughter to stop them from keeping a close eye on her movements. She bit her lip, a little annoyed that she hadn't thought to feign more happiness at the idea of marrying Darius. If she played it right, they might have left her alone for a few days at least. As it stood, she knew she could expect a visit from her father the next day at the latest, especially if She didn't turn up to work. No, she only had tonight, and she would only be able to take whatever would fit in her car. She dialed Naomi's number as she worked, put her friend on the loudspeaker and continued to sort through her clothing. Her room was starting to look like a bomb had hit it. Why on earth did she have so many clothes? What's wrong, babe? You never call this late when you have to work the next day. I'm not going to work, Allie said flatly. She heard Naomi's intake of breath on the phone. Alexandra, I have never seen you take a sick day in your life. It's not a sick day. I'm quitting. This time Naomi must have actually dropped her phone in shock. Allie heard the dull thump, then the soft swearing of her friend as she retrieved the handset. You are what? Quitting. Work, the pack, the family. Everything. Holy shit. Who are you and what have you done with Allie? They want me to marry Darius. They're trying to force me. There was a long silence on the other end of the phone. I'm coming over. Great. Allie smiled at the phone. Thank God for good friends. I love you. Nay. Love you too, you mad bitch. Quitting. I cannot believe. The phone cut off. As Naomi hung it up, Allie winced to herself thinking about the kind of speed at which her best friend was about to drive over to the house. Hopefully, she'd make it in one piece. Not much later, she heard an urgent knocking at her door, and her jaw dropped. Open. Even for Naomi that was fast. She shuddered to think of the kinds of speed she'd gotten up to on the quiet roads. Leaving her suitcase open, Allie walked into the living room and opened the door. But it wasn't Naomi. It was Nicholas. She stared her alpha in the face, full of shock and that old ancestral instinct to obey, to be a good wolf, to do what he needed. He inclined his head to her, stepping into the house. She glanced outside and saw two cars, not one, parked in her driveway, blocking her car. Worry began to roil in her gut, and she glanced down the hall to her room, where the door was standing open, and her suitcase was in full view. Had Nicholas seen it? She glanced at him worriedly, but he was pacing in her living room, seemingly lost in thought. With any luck, he hadn't seen her escape attempt in the making. He was probably just here to make sure she was falling in line, doing what she was told, being a good wolf, getting ready to marry Darius. If anything, this was a good opportunity to put his mind at rest, and maybe by extension her father's. In 9th grade they had studied Romeo and Juliet. She remembered the scene between Juliet and her parents, in which they told her they'd arranged for her to marry Paris in an attempt to cheer her up after the death of her cousin, Tybalt. She'd been amazed at how cold, how cruel Juliet's father, Lord Capulet, had been to her when she'd resisted the idea of being married to a man she didn't love. It wasn't realistic, she'd thought, rolling her eyes. Just silly drama. She'd never liked Shakespeare much, but here she was bound to marry a man she despised. And her family was doing exactly what Lord Capulet had done, bullying her into it, telling her not to be so childish, so selfish, to do what was right for the family and for the pack. But unlike Juliet, she was 28 damn years old and she had a car. And if Nicholas thought that he could manipulate her into marrying that frogman, he had another thing coming. Not just yet, though. She needed him to move his car so she could get out. She needed to play this one carefully. So she summoned a smile and moved to join Nicholas where he'd taken a seat at her dining table. Alexandra, I wanted to talk to you about this evening. Yes. He was staring her down and she avoided his eyes, not wanting to seem insubordinate, and also worried that he'd sense her deception if he got a good look at her. She'd never tried to lie to an alpha before. The rumor was that it was impossible. Your reaction to Darius's proposal troubled me. I wouldn't want you to feel like you were being pressured. Oh, that's kind of you, Nicholas. She gazed demurely into her lap. I suppose I was just in shock a little bit. It was such a surprise. An unpleasant one? No. There it was. There was the biggest lie she'd ever told. It was surprisingly easy to. Emboldened by this, she looked up at him. You know, me, Nicholas. I have always wanted to do what's best for the pack. And if marrying Darius will make the pack stronger, well, I'm thrilled. I just wasn't expecting it, that's all. It is an honor I dream not of, Juliet had said early in the play when her parents were floating the idea of marrying Paris. Why had that line stuck with her? Because it was sneaky, she realized. Finally, It was a way of avoiding the subject of marriage altogether while still appearing humble and obedient to her parents. Juliet was pretty smart. For a 13-year-old. Your parents are worried you don't feel that way, Nicholas said steadily, his cold eyes boring through her. She resisted the urge to shift in her seat like a guilty child. Your father especially is worried that you might do something inadvisable in an attempt to avoid the wedding. Inadvisable? Like what? She tried to muster a realistic laugh. I work for my father. If I disobeyed him, I could hardly avoid seeing him. No, that wasn't the right tact. Besides, I'm looking forward to marrying Darius. He's a good man. Time for the big guns, Allie. I find him very attractive. I had to work quite hard to keep things professional between us. I'm worried he thought I was cold. Had that worked? Impossible to get a read on Nicholas. Good to hear. Marriage, you see, is a choice. Like a business arrangement. These days young people are very hung up on the idea of romance. But as you grow older you learn that romance fades and something else takes its place. Do you know what that is? Love. Power. His eyes gleamed. Two people together are more powerful than two people separately. It's why we live in packs, Alexandra, and why we always have. You and Darius are powerful wolves. Together you'll be an even stronger asset to the pack. You want that, right? I do, she whispered. Good. Then you'll come and stay with me. Until the wedding. What? Quarters have already been arranged at my home. I trust you'll be comfortable. We'll leave once you've packed. Allie took a deep breath. Her heart was pounding. Can I ask you something? Nicholas. Anything. Do I have a choice? I'll wait here for you to finish gathering your things. Allie stood stiff-legged and walked down the hallway to her room, hardly able to believe what was happening. She was being kidnapped. This was real life. Her dreams of heading for the middle of the country were melting away before her eyes. Panic began to thump hard in her chest. What was she going to do? Was Nicholas going to frog march her down the aisle, bind her to Darius with a literal silver chain, keep a sharp eye on her for the rest of her life to make sure she was doing her duty, being a good wife, raising the next generation of obedient little wolves, foot soldiers for their vast empire? Was this what had happened to her mother? She finished packing her suitcase in a daze, trying not to think about what she was doing. She reached for her phone to call someone, anyone, then realized it had been in her hand when she'd gone to get the door. She'd left it on the dining table with Nicholas. Well, he'd have it now. With dread sitting in her chest like a physical force, she finished zipping her suitcase. Then very quickly, in a spot in her room that was out of sight, she scribbled a note to Naomi. She could only hope that her best friend would figure out what had happened when she arrived and could find a way to break her out. It was a long shot, but it was her only hope. Ready to go? Nicholas asked, standing by her doorway as though he were there on a social call. She nodded, lifting her suitcase in one hand, and glanced casually over to the dining table where she'd left her phone. Sure enough, it was gone. At least it was locked, she thought with some relief. He wouldn't be able to go through her messages and find out about anything important, like Ben. She felt a pang of grief at the thought that he wouldn't know what had happened to her. But if they were really intending on mobilizing against Fel, well, he'd find out sooner or later. Could she pretend to be on their side, maybe? Was she a good enough actor to earn their trust and maybe turn against them at a crucial moment? No, she realized as she saw how many men were in the car behind Nicholas's. They didn't trust her as far as they could throw her. He'd brought enough men to bring down even her wolf form, which meant he'd expected her to fight. Maybe she should have. Was it too late to shift now? Too late to take her wolf form and kill as many of them as she could? No. Naomi was on her way over, and if she arrived at a fight, she'd be bound to join in on Allie's side, thus ruining her own life in the village. Forever. She'd wind up in exile at best. Worst case, she'd be killed along with Allie. She couldn't do that to Naomi. She had to play the long game. Maybe, if she was patient enough and dedicated enough to the disguise of an obedient little lapdog to Darius, her alpha, and her family, she would find a chance to escape. Or better yet, overthrow the alpha. Allie knew one thing for certain. As the car pulled away from her old home, she had no loyalty left here anymore. Chapter 13. Ben couldn't shake the sense of unease in his chest as the hours dragged on. After the meeting with Rex and Alan, he'd sat in his car outside Rex's house for 10 minutes just hitting redial over and over. The first few times it had rung out. Then something changed and he simply got her voicemail message as soon as the call went through. Friendly, professional and positive. The worry twisted at his gut every time he heard her bright voicemail message. What if something was terribly wrong? What if her pack or her alpha or her father or that Darius scumbag had done something to her? He just kept praying she was going to pick up the phone. But she didn't. He sent her a couple of texts, asking her to call him ASAP because he was worried about her, that he wanted to hear from her as soon as she could contact him, no matter what time of the day or night. At home it was hard to sleep and Ben got out of bed again. He was worried. Sick about Allie, of course, but he realized he was worried about his pack, too. The idea of war was so strange and laughable that even considering it felt hard. Wolf against wolf like in the old days? There had been peace for so long. Shifters were powerful, they knew that about themselves. They could do a lot of damage if provoked, which was why so much of their social order revolved around keeping everyone calm and diplomatic, on friendly terms. The most dangerous time was meant to be the full moon, when transformations had to be carefully controlled and managed. But those rules went out the window if the Sanguine pack really did intend to march on smaller packs like a conquering force. Their wolf forms wouldn't be limited to the full moon. And wasn't Nicholas one of those die-hard fundamentalists from the old days? He remembered Allie saying something about it a long time ago, and from what he'd gathered from the meeting that night, the information was solid. Some wolves hated human beings for what they'd done to the country. They felt humans should be rounded up and kept prisoner in limited parts of the country. Some of them even thought they should be done away with entirely. Wolves were more in touch with the land, the argument went. They'd take better care of it than humans had. You only had to look at the catastrophic environmental damage that human rule of the planet had caused to see where their ideas had come from, as horrible as they were. But Ben liked humans. Most of them anyway. It wasn't like they were all perfect, but who was? If wolf society had people like Allie's father, people like Nicholas, people like Darius, for God's sake, then surely they'd lost all their right to judge humankind. He paced up and down in his kitchen now, jiggling his phone in his right hand. Ben knew he should get some rest, but the idea of sleeping could not have been further from his mind right now. Not with a war on their doorstep. Not with Allie possibly in danger and out of communication. But his rational side asserted itself. If there was going to be a war, or if he was going to need to go to Allie's rescue, he'd be in a much better position to help if he'd had some sleep. Besides, it was business as usual at the grocery store tomorrow. He couldn't take the day off just because there might be a war coming. People still needed their food and supplies at a time like this. Hell, they needed them more than ever. If Sanguine marched on Fell, who knew how long the residents would need to hole up in their houses? He fell into a fitful sleep on the couch eventually, his phone still clutched in his hand. He'd turned it up as loud as it went, knowing that if Allie called, the loud ringing would definitely wake him up. He jerked awake with the sun in his face as the phone sounded, full of hope, then immediately back to crushing dread and worry as he realized it was just his alarm waking him up for his shift. After a few more tries of Allie's number, which went straight to voicemail, indicating her phone must be switched off, he dragged himself into the shower and got ready for work. It was hard to talk himself into it when he was itching so badly to know where Allie was, if she was okay. Then he made a deal with himself. He'd keep his phone in his pocket all through his shift. By the end of the day, he still hadn't heard from her. He'd drive straight to Sanguine and find her, and to hell with the consequences. Rex probably wouldn't approve, he thought with a guilty little thrill, but what was really important here? Allie. If he had to choose between the newfound respect and the pack he'd discovered in Allie, well, it was a wrench, but it was Allie every time. That certainty made him strong. He got to work earlier than he usually did, pulling into a mostly empty parking lot with time to spare. Good. Maybe he'd try ringing Allie a few times before he had to open the doors and put on the tinny music that played all day. But as he walked across the parking lot, he frowned. There was a red-headed woman leaning on the glass doors, her manicured fingertips drumming impatiently on the glass. Some people were in such a rush to get there Groceries. We open at 9. He called as he got close enough to see her face, then frowned. She was familiar. Too familiar. Are you? You seriously don't recognize me? Again? Some boyfriend you turned out to be, the woman growled. Naomi. He stared at her. In my defense, you changed your hair. What was she doing here? Why was she here alone in foreign territory? The wolves of Fel and Sanguine didn't tend to cross each other's paths. She was taking kind of a risk by being here at all, let alone treating him with this kind of hostility. The woman ran an irritable hand through her red hair. No time to chat. I need your help. It's about Allie. The panic sank into his gut again, hot and immediate. What's wrong? She called me last night really upset. Her father's trying to make her marry this creep Darius to make the pack stronger and drive more money into his pockets, prize asshole that he is. She called me too. Is she okay? I haven't heard from her since last night. Me neither. Naomi's face was grim. I was driving over to help her pack. She was planning on leaving town completely. I guess you were probably gonna be stop on that particular road trip, she added, giving him a suspicious look. Naomi never had liked him, he thought ruefully. That was the job of a best friend though, especially with girls. Men couldn't be trusted. Well, look at Darius. Could he really blame her? He was just grateful she was here with more information than he'd had about what was going on. Then what happened? I pulled up to her place. Her car was still there, but there were tire marks on the lawn and the house was empty. She left her door unlocked though. Suitcase gone, a bunch of her favorite clothes gone, phone gone. I thought she might have panicked and left early until I found a note hidden in her room. She said Nicholas had come to get her, and that he was going to keep her at his house until the wedding. The guy must have her phone. You know what alphas are like. Rex would never do that, Ben said flatly. Whatever. Anyway, I wanted to call you, but I don't have your number. Then I remembered you whining all the time about how boring it was to work at your dad's grocery store, so here I am. Lucky guess. So what are we gonna do? Go get her, Ben said immediately. Go through anyone we have to go through. 2 of us against a couple of dozen wolves with combat training and an alpha? Great idea. Really great. Are you kidding me? You're the guy she's been obsessed with for 10 years? Whatever. Okay. Can you think of a better plan than that at all? Ben hesitated. Not unless you're secretly a spy or something. Naomi gritted her teeth. I'll talk to my alpha. Sanguine's on the warpath from what Allie was telling me, and nobody here's keen on all-out war. Come with me. We'll talk to Rex and Alan and the elders, and maybe they'll help us take Nicholas down and put an end to this plan. If we stop the wedding, Darius won't join forces with Nicholas, right? It's kind of everyone's business at this point. Naomi nodded. The more firepower, the better. I know there aren't many of you, but we should have the element of surprise at least. They won't be expecting a move against them for a little while. Valley played it right. Nicholas probably thinks that nobody knows where she is. Naomi smiled. And she's smart as hell and good in a crisis, so I think we can count on that. Come with me to meet with Rex? Ben asked, fumbling his phone out of his pocket. The word of a Sanguine pack member will mean a lot. He hesitated. No, I'm asking you to betray your pack. What pack? They kidnapped my friend and are planning on starting a war. Don't owe them shit. Ben reflected quietly that he wouldn't want to get on Naomi's bad side in 1,000 years. She'd been a scary teenager, and she was a scarier adult. He dialed a number on his phone and waited for a sleepy voice to sound on the other end. Hey Tyler. Listen, you know how I trained you on tills last week? Yeah. How soon can you get in? Yeah, that'll do. Hey buddy. You want to put management experience on your resume? Looks good on college applications. One slightly nonplussed conversation with Tyler later, Ben hid the keys to the store where Tyler had agreed to pick them up. He was pretty sure the teenager understood what was expected of him. He headed for his car, but Naomi made a derisive sound in the back of her throat and jerked her head towards the only other car in the parking lot. I'm driving. You'll be too slow. He bristled at that but had to admit, as she slammed her car into gear and took off with a screech of tires that would have put a NASCAR race to shame, that he wouldn't have driven this quickly, or this dangerously. He could barely shout directions to Rex's house over the sound of squealing brakes and frightened, angry horn honking from other drivers. But they made record time. He had to admit. Her methods may have been unorthodox, but who knew how much time they had to waste? Poor Allie was probably so frightened, locked up, unable to communicate, not even sure that anyone knew they were coming for her. As far as he was concerned, Naomi couldn't drive fast enough. They ran up the steps to Rex's house, and he pressed the doorbell while she hammered on the ornate wooden door. Overkill perhaps, but he didn't want to criticize her manners at a time like this. Soon enough, the door swung open, and Rex himself stood there, blinking a little in confusion, a coffee mug in his hand. He was dressed at least, and Ben was so relieved that he was there that he sagged a little. Rex, I'm so sorry to disturb you like this, but who's this? Rex's eyes were on Naomi, who was staring straight back at him, with a defiance that made Ben instinctively cringe. She really must have abandoned all allegiance with her pack, he thought with wonder at the way she squared up to the alpha, her eyes meeting his without any sign of fear or the ancestral, instinctive need to defer to a more powerful wolf. She was alone. Wolf now. Naomi, she said, voice low and flat. You're Rex, right? Alpha of Fel, yes, Rex said, and Ben could hear the telltale sound of annoyance in his voice. The usually friendly Alpha had a way of seeming extremely calm when he was about to snap, and Ben could hear that quality in his voice now. We don't have much time. Call your people. We've got to move. Ben, who is this? Rex, sorry, can we come in? Naomi's from Sanguine. Well, she used to be. Anyway. He corrected himself as Naomi's back stiffened. The stuff that we were talking about yesterday? It's worse than we thought, and it's escalating. Ah, so you're Ben's mysterious source of intel. I'm glad you're safe. Actually, Ben took a deep breath. It was time to come clean. My source is Allie, the woman who's being held prisoner right now. She's the one who told me to tell you about Nicholas and the war. And it's her who's being traded off to Darius in exchange for firepower to use against us. Rex looked at them both, his gaze calm and steady. You both care about this woman, I can tell. And you've done the pack a great service by keeping us abreast of what's going on. What can we do to get her out of that situation? Ben almost collapsed with relief. You'll help save her? Ben, just because she belongs to a different pack doesn't mean she's a different species. She's being held against her will and forced to marry someone. Of course we'll intercede. And when the dust settles, however it settles, well, Fel's got something of a history of taking an ex-sanguine wolves without prejudice. Rex smiled a little. That goes for you too, Naomi. Fel could use some of that fire of yours if you're willing to share it. I'll see. Naomi hadn't flinched. First things first, we need to get Allie out. How much firepower do you have? A wise leader exhausts diplomatic options first, Rex said flatly, and there was steel in his voice now. I'll help your friend, but I will not put lives in danger if there's a chance this can be talked out. And speaking of talking, I'll need to consult the other elders. He pulled a phone out of his pocket. Ben couldn't help but smile when he saw that Rex had Alan on speed dial. Naomi growled and clenched her fists. Ben shot her the firmest warning look he could. Please come inside, Rex added, gesturing for them to come through to the sitting room. I'll make the calls I need to make and be back with you shortly. Anything could be happening right now, Naomi muttered after Rex had moved into the study, talking low and urgently into his phone. She could be walking down the aisle this minute, and we're sitting here while your alpha makes phone calls. Sanguine would never. Sanguine is about to start a war, Ben said irritably, feeling a flare of anger on behalf of his alpha overtake him for a moment, making him forget how much Naomi intimidated him. And its alpha is currently forcing one of its most loyal and valuable members to marry a scumbag for his own personal ambitions. Be very careful about the comparisons you make between our packs. Naomi sat very still for a moment, and Ben was worried she was going to tear his throat out. Then unexpectedly she grinned and leaned across to punch him affectionately on the shoulder. That's much more like it. If you're going to go the distance with Allie, you're going to need to show a lot more of that backbone, you hear? As worried as he was, Ben couldn't help but smile. It looked like he was starting to win over Allie's best friend. I guess I can do that, he admitted. Good. You'd better keep me on your side after all. It's not like her parents are ever going to like you. Ben snorted laughter at that. Yeah, kind of burned a bridge or two there. Huh. Their fault. Naomi crossed her legs, craning her neck over her shoulder as they waited for Rex to get finished with his phone calls. To her credit, she didn't complain again about the democratic way the man ran the fell pack. It felt like several hours but could only have been 20 minutes or so. When Rex returned to them, putting his phone away, he explained that he'd gotten in touch with a few key elders and explained the situation. Ellen was making the rest of the calls, but the consensus was overwhelmingly in favor of acting swiftly against the sanguine pack. The fact that Allie was being held a prisoner in the interests of forcing her to marry someone she didn't love had been a particularly damning piece of information from what Rex explained to them. And you're sure she'll be at Nicholas's place? Naomi nodded firmly. That's the message Allie left for me, and as far as I can tell, nobody had intercepted it. That's where she'll be. Under his feet. Where he can control her. Good. I've organized a delegation to accompany me to Nicholas's home. I'll go and speak to him, tell him in no uncertain terms that his conduct is unacceptable and extract a renewal of the peace treaties and a promise of non-aggression from him. If that's not possible, then it's war, Naomi said quickly, her eyes flashing. Rex sighed. I don't want that. But if Nicholas proves unreasonable, I'll do what I can against him. Last time we had a problem like this, it was the Alpha that was fault, not the pack. He and Darius are our problem, not the whole pack. Ben took a deep breath. He knew what Rex was saying, knew from the steady, unflinching expression in his eyes that he meant it too. If it came to it, Rex would fight the sanguine Alpha himself. And when Alphas fought, they usually fought to the death. Fear began to stir in his belly, and even Naomi looked a little concerned. We'll be at your side. No, Rex said, frowning. You're too close to this, both of you. I can tell. Ben blanched. Did Rex seriously expect him to just wait here while the pack went to save the woman he loved? Naomi was bristling too, all but growling as she eyed the Alpha. Rex sighed, putting his hands up as he saw the identical looks of mutiny in the younger wolves' faces. You can both come along, but you'll stay in the car with the others, you understand? You'll come out only if Nicholas and I are unable to come to an agreement. Is that understood? Ben and Naomi looked at each other and nodded. He could tell from the look in her eyes that she, like him, very much expected diplomacy to. Chapter 14. It had been quite late when they'd arrived at Nicholas's house. Ellie had hardly bothered looking out the window. She'd been here a few times in her years, usually for elaborate and irritating parties and formal events. She didn't need to look at the place again to remember that it was just like her parents' overambitious mansion, only bigger and more ostentatious. Nicholas really liked everyone to know he was the most influential man in town. Some point, the car following them, which was presumably full of his additional henchmen, had peeled off and disappeared, so it was just her and Nicholas plus a couple of black-suited bodyguards who walked up the path towards the looming house. One of them tried to carry her bag for her, but she refused to relinquish it. She wasn't giving them anything for free. They damn well have to fight her for it. You must be hungry, Nicholas said dispassionately as they stepped into the foyer of his huge home. You hardly touched your dinner. I'm fine, she said woodenly. Then her stomach growled, betraying her. Nicholas heaved a sigh. Alexandra, I am not trying to torture you. I am your Alpha, like your father. I know what is best for you, and I am acting in your interests. Even if you don't see that right now, you will. He turned and began to make his way up the ornate staircase, not looking back. He's right, sweetheart. Allie's head jerked up. Standing in Nicholas's elaborate kitchen was her mother. She had changed out of the elaborate gown she'd been wearing earlier into an only slightly less formal house dress, and taken her earrings out. In her hands she held a plate of what looked like spinach and feta pastries, one of Allie's favorite snacks from her childhood. Really? This was what it had come down to? Her mother helping her Alpha keep her hostage in his house, trying to bribe her with food? Some of these thoughts must have shown on Allie's face because Olga looked crestfallen. Allie, I know you must be angry now. I know how you're feeling. The woman crossed to her daughter in short strides, took Allie's hands in one of hers, with an uncharacteristically sincere look of worry in her eyes. You have to believe me. I've stood where you're standing now, Alexandra. Allie's eyes widened despite herself. You mean Dad? I didn't want to marry him, but it was the best decision that was ever made. For me, you understand. She squeezed Allie's hands, and Allie stared at her, mother in shock. Were those real tears in her eyes? She had never seen Olga express emotion like this. Whenever things got real, she would retire to her room claiming a headache. Because marrying him brought me you. Mother. She was torn. How could she explain to her mother that she was in love with someone else, that Darius repelled her, that even if she had wanted to marry him, she couldn't bring about a war with a neighboring pack? Shoo, darling. Just eat something and get some rest, okay? Your room is lovely, I've made sure of it. Have something to eat, get some rest, and we'll talk tomorrow. Things always seem clearer in the light of day, haven't I always said that? Allie smiled despite herself, feeling curiously close to her mother at this moment. She'd spent so much of her life chafing against her father, his icy calm, his unassailable demands. But Olga had had to live with him for even longer. At least Allie had the reprieve of work and her own home to escape to. What did Olga have, except for the social events she was constantly, obsessively planning? Allie nibbled on the pastries in silence, her mother standing by her side in the empty kitchen. Once she'd finished, they made their way down a staircase she hadn't seen before to a tastefully decorated basement. Seriously? Allie said quietly as Olga opened the door to a small bedroom. Tastefully decorated? I'm being locked up in a cellar? It's the nicest guest room in the house, Olga said forcefully. I checked them all. This one has a much bigger ensuite than the one upstairs and a better quality mattress. Allie raised her hands, too tired to argue with her mother. She knew she was a prisoner, this just made it that much clearer. She sat heavily on the edge of the bed, rubbing tiredly at her eyes. Her mother was right, it was a very comfortable mattress. She could hear her mother fussing about turning down the quilt and ushering her into bed. And before she could say much more about anything at all, Allie found herself drifting off to sleep. It could have been years that she was asleep, so deep and dreamless was her slumber. Allie found her eyelids flickering open an eternity later, responding to the way the lights around the room were coming on slowly but gradually, bringing light to the whole room. Some kind of programming that mimicked dawn. She thought drowsily, sitting up and lifting a hand to rub her face, then blinked in consternation at a strange feeling of restriction. She looked down, surprised to see a strange white quilt covering her. Hadn't the blankets on the bed been gray? No. The blankets were folded neatly at the bottom of the bed. The heap of white fabric on her lap was... What? Allie all but shrieked, lunging to her feet with the adrenaline of shock coursing around her body. She almost fell over, her balance shifting strangely, the way it usually did when she had a nasty cold or the flu. Her head throbbed dizzily as she stared down at her body. She was wearing a dress. No, not just a dress. It was a wedding dress, exquisitely tailored to her body. She thought sickly. It fitted her every curve perfectly, and on the bedside table waiting for her was a veil. How the hell? She staggered away from the bed, searching for a mirror, her hands already fumbling at the dress, searching for a zip or a button, something to unfasten it and claw it from her body. Who had dressed her in her sleep? How had they not woken her up? She was a heavy sleeper, sure, but to get her into something like this, they must have... No, surely not. Oh, Alexandra. Her eyes rose, unbelieving, to where her mother stood in the door, dressed in a sleek gray dress and high heels. The makeup on her face looked professionally done. Allie had difficulty believing her eyes, partly because of the false eyelashes and partly because her mother was doing everything she could to avoid making eye contact with her daughter. Mother, you drugged me. Come on, Alexandra, Olga said briskly, her words cutting her daughter's sentence short. We've got to be going. The ceremony's in an hour. I'm not going anywhere. Allie almost screamed, feeling a flare of the wolf roar through her body, and just as quickly a crippling blast of nausea that almost doubled her over. Her mother moved quickly to her side, steadying her, even as she tried to push her away. Allie, I'm so sorry, Olga breathed in her ear, so quietly she almost thought she was hallucinating it. But if you don't come willingly... She broke off, looking up through the open door to the room. There stood Nicholas and Andre, both clad in matching suits, and behind them a generous contingent of Nicholas's bodyguards. The message was clear. Come quietly or see how we'll go about making you. Allie looked at her mother, at the brave smile the woman had plastered across her face. This close she could finally see what the look in Olga's eyes was. The distant, alienating expression that had bothered Allie for most of her life. It was fear. The men lead her up the staircase. Allie followed dully, eyes on the ground. She was going to fight this, that was all she knew. It was just a question of where. As they lingered in the hallway, Olga fussed at Allie's hair, pinning it into place. Allie realized with a sickening lurch that her mother had even put makeup on her face while she was asleep. How strong had the drugs been? Exactly? Strong enough that she still felt sick to her stomach, though the prospect of a forced wedding was certainly contributing to that as well. She had two hopes. One was that Naomi had gotten her message and was somehow going to come out of left field and save her. If anyone could do it, it was Naomi. The second and rather more desperate hope was that she could somehow overpower all these men in her wolf shape and make a bid for freedom. Honestly, at this point, if asked to choose between dying in battle and marrying Darius, she'd die in battle dozens of times before even looking him in the eye. The thought was so compelling that she was halfway to letting her anger run loose through her body before she remembered. Ben was out there. Somewhere. Tears sprang to her eyes at the thought of never seeing him again. No. She owed it to him to wait. If there was any chance of getting out of this shit show alive, she was going to take it. Even if it meant burning down the life she'd known. The life she'd known had led her here, to Darius's car. Bound for a wedding she hadn't consented to. The life she'd known meant nothing to her anymore. You look gorgeous, came that hideous voice. I know it's bad luck to see the bride before the wedding, but I just couldn't help myself. And besides, it's only an hour away. Allie stared out of the window, silent. Darius had made it clear over and over that he didn't care if she was uncomfortable with him, if she got angry or frustrated with him. If anything, it seemed to delight him the angrier she got with his behavior. The only way she had left to get at him, the only thing that would work, was ignoring him. Sure enough, after a minute of staring out the window, she could feel his anger in the sharp way he started driving the car. It gave her a little buzz of satisfaction, truth be told. She peered behind them, noticing a line of cars following them, and she tried to figure out where they were going. Knowing her family, it would be a remote winery or something. Somewhere posh and fancy enough that the photos would look great on social media, but far enough away from everything that if their renegade daughter made a scene, it would be easily contained. Nausea pulsed behind her eyes at the thought of what was awaiting her. How were they going to orchestrate this? Would her father march her down the aisle with a gun to her back, like a weird reversal of the old shotgun wedding trope? How would they force her to say the words, sign the documents? A flash of her mother's face, the thinly veiled terror in her eyes, and she knew immediately how they were going to do it. They'd threaten Olga. For all that their relationship was strained at times, she loved her mother, and though a week ago she'd have laughed at the prospect of her father allowing any harm to befall her family, she knew now that she'd been hopelessly naive. Back then, could her mother still shift? Could they fight together, maybe? They could take down Nicholas quickly, his men would surely scatter. The nausea was pressing hard now, and she realized with a start that she was about to throw up. She turned to Darius, half tempted to just throw up all over the dress she was wearing. The drugs, she forced out. I'm gonna throw up. He actually recoiled from her like a small child who'd seen a gross bug on the playground, and she fought the urge to roll her eyes. This guy was meant to lead their pack to war? This guy who couldn't even cope with the idea of vomit? He pulled the car over abruptly and unlocked the door for her. She gathered the stupid skirts around her legs and staggered out. They were on a road outside of town that she recognized as being on the way to Fell. There were several cars in their little parade. The one behind Darius's had her mother and father in it, Olga's face pale and drawn behind the glass, Andre stone-faced as always. Allie bent over and threw up into the grass, feeling instantly better despite the unpleasant experience. Good, she thought dizzily. At least her breath would reek of vomit when Darius leaned in to kiss her. Maybe he would find her a tiny fraction as repulsive as she found him. She looked up at the horizon, hands still on her knees, not sure whether she needed to throw up again, then frowned as she saw a car racing towards them. Not just one car either. There were several behind it. And there was something familiar about it, about the car and about the hectic way it was being driven. No way, she breathed, hardly daring to believe her eyes. Naomi. Darius's door opened and the wolf stepped out, his eyes narrowed. Sure enough, the other cars began to slow as they approached them. Allie guessed that her bright white wedding dress had drawn a bit of attention. Good. Her heart was pounding. If Naomi was here, did that mean she'd gotten her note? Did that mean... Allie! Ben's voice rang out across the road like a shot, and there he was, climbing out of the passenger seat of Naomi's car before it had even fully stopped, half stumbling as he sprinted across the road towards her. She threw her arms around him as he collided with her, squeezing her so tightly that she felt him lift her off the ground, and she laughed dizzily as he swung her around. I was so worried, he was murmuring in her ear, lowering her gently to the ground and staring into her eyes. What have they done to you? They haven't. Not yet, she said quickly, gesturing at the dress. Not yet. And who the hell do you think you are? Darius was there, inches from them, his froggy face apoplectic with rage. Allie tensed, felt the blood singing in her veins, ready right then and there to shift form, but Ben was calm. He turned to Darius, looking him dead in the I'm the wolf she actually loves, he said, ice in his voice. Shame you'll never know what that feels like. Later, Allie would comment that all of it had almost been worth it just for the look of pure rage on Darius's face. But before she could think too much about that, Nicholas's men were climbing out of the cars behind them, falling into like behind Darius. Ben narrowed his eyes, stretching his neck. She could sense that he was preparing to shift forms. Shame about the dress, Allie said, smiling as widely as she could at Darius, and she had the satisfaction of meeting his eyes as that smile split wide and jagged across her face as her fangs came through. The dress tore almost immediately as her body swelled and grew, all the anger she'd been restraining for years and years suddenly surging through her, transforming the human flesh into something different, something stronger. It felt so good, her jaws coming forward, the muscle thickening, her broad, powerful shoulders shredding the wedding dress like so much tissue paper. Beside her, Ben was changing shape, too. She could see his russet fur covering his body, even as she felt her own coarse dark brown fur spreading across her body. Darius was shifting too, but he was too slow. Ben had pounced, his jaws snapping shut inches from the man's still human face and his claws raking at the tuxedo he was wearing. That wasn't going to come out in the wash, Allie thought gleefully, lowering her head and snarling at the men behind Darius and Ben. They were shifting too, and she hurled herself at them with all the force she had at her disposal, the blood singing in her veins. There was a familiar wolf at her side suddenly, a wolf with jet black fur and bright blue eyes, a wolf she'd run with moon after moon, and she fought the urge to howl for joy. Naomi always had her back in a fight. The two she-wolves tore into the line of sanguine bodyguards even as Ben and Darius grappled with one another in the grass by the side of the road. Soon enough, everyone was in wolf form, and it was all-out war by the side of the road. Allie couldn't stop to think what a human would make of this sight. All she knew was that she had to keep her wits about her. Naomi had her back, of course, and Ben was fighting at her side, and they had been joined by some unfamiliar and very welcome fell wolves, but they were still outnumbered by the sanguine guards. A chill came over the scene, and Allie felt herself slow down against her will. She wasn't alone in feeling that pull. There, standing on the road, full head taller than any wolf present, was an enormous shaggy-pelted silver wolf with cold eyes, squaring off against an equally enormous dark wolf, whose pelt was scarred in several places by white fur, the telltale sign of surviving a fight with an alpha. Nicholas was the silver. Allie recognized him from a full moon before he'd been alpha. He'd been formidable then, but this was something else. But there stood Rex, calmly confident. He'd already killed one sanguine alpha before. The wolves gazed at their leaders, horrified by what this meant. One way or another, if this fight took place, an alpha would be killed. And that could be life or death for her and Ben. As Nicholas leapt at Rex, Allie let out a yelp of warning, but it wasn't for either alpha. It was for Ben, who, distracted by the battle, hadn't noticed Darius gathering himself for a sneak attack. Allie howled as Ben went down under the other wolf's gnashing jaws. She saw several deep wounds ripped in his body, but a sanguine wolf blocked her from going to his aid. Blood sang in her ears as she made short work of the obstruction. Behind her she could hear Rex and Nicholas tearing at one another, but all she cared about was Ben, the horrible sounds he was making as Darius tried his hardest to kill the only man she'd ever loved. Naomi was there, her pelt soaked through with blood and a mad light glinting in her eye. She leapt at Darius, knocking him away from Ben's prone form, and Allie saw him rise, unsteady on his paws but alive, thank God. He went after Darius again, and Allie turned back to the battle in time to see her mother climbing out of the car where her father was still sitting in the driver's seat. Olga's back was stiff, and her eyes were full of a rage Allie had never seen, and as she moved, Allie could see the muscles beginning to ripple along her back as the change began. But whose side was she coming to join? Andre was yelling at her to get back in the car, but she ignored him, her long white fur beginning to cover her body. Allie was riveted despite herself. Her mother had always made shifting look so graceful. But before the white wolf could join the fray, a tremendous shriek went up, and every wolf present turned as though drawn by supernatural focus to where the alphas were tearing at one another. Allie's heart leapt into her throat. Rex was pinned beneath Nicholas's huge paws, and the silver wolf's jaws were inches from his throat. And then, as smoothly as a cat twisting around midair to land on its feet, Rex twisted his body, threw Nicholas off balance, and plunged his jaws straight into his unprotected throat. Nicholas made a choking sound, impulsively trying to tear himself away from the dark wolf's jaws, which only served to intensify the damage. Rex jerked his head savagely to the side, and with a sickening, tearing sound, the huge silver wolf fell to the ground and lay still. The sanguine wolves stared at each other, unsure, and then, in a universal gesture of submission, dropped to their bellies in the blood-stained grass. Allie stood, head down, breathing hard. Naomi howled triumphantly, and the sound was taken up by the rest of the fell wolves, who were all moving to their alpha's side to congratulate him on his bloody victory. But where was Ben? Allie broke away from the pack, scanning wildly for the wolf. She saw Darius, life-threatening wounds in his belly, lying in the mud, but she couldn't feel anything but fear for Ben. Where was he? Naomi's voice sounded behind her. Human again. The woman was standing unsteadily in the mud, still breathing hard. Blood looked a lot more dramatic when it was dripping from human jaws. Allie thought to herself, a little in awe of her best friend. But Naomi was pointing to a shallow ditch by the road, and Allie's heart leapt into her throat as she saw Ben lying there. Ben, no, she said to him as soon as she had vocal cords. She probably looked hideous, only half shifted back to human, covered in blood, her hair a mess. But she couldn't care. As his wolf form retreated as well, she caught her breath at the savage extent of his injuries. Bite marks littered his torso, including several deep wounds around his shoulders and throat where Darius had attempted to rip out his jugular. His face was battered and torn too. You better stay alive, you hear me? She whispered to him, tears in her eyes. He groaned, then spoke, his voice almost inaudible. She leaned in closer, desperate to pick up what he was saying. Are you going to make me? And if Naomi, standing watch over the pair, thought it was strange that her best friend burst out laughing, then collapsed almost straight away into tears, she kept it to herself.